So without much ado, I leave you, Judy.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming to my talk today. My name is Jonathan Deitch, JD. I'm the Chief Operating Officer for Ask Your Target Market. And I'm here today to kind of challenge your thinking on the role of machines in our industry. I think it's indisputable that machines have been at the core of change in our industry for decades. What's really interesting about that, though, is that we haven't always welcomed them into our enterprise, have we? We've tended to view them pretty much with suspicion. And yet, over the course of time, they become embedded as part of what we do. We believe that we're actually ready for the next wave of machine-driven revolution. And if you can tell by the title, it will be ways in which the machines are starting to replace the humans in our endeavor. I think it's interesting to think about the trajectory, the historical arc of machines in our industry. And let's start that story with these two sharp-looking fellas. That's Joe Woodland over there on the left, and that's Bernard Silver on the right. Joe and Bernard were students at Drexel University in Philadelphia in 1948 when a supermarket executive came into the dean of the engineering school and asked him if he could help develop codes that they could attach to products so that they could track these products through the inventory cycle and then ultimately when they were sold. So Joe actually sat down and thought about this, was inspired by kind of the dots and the dashes in Morse code, and he came up with this system of lines of alternating length, and the barcode was born. That's the drawing from the patent. Joe and Bernard won a patent for this in I think it was 1949. You can see it's round here, the first implementation. And they went and they built a prototype machine in 1952. The only problem was that this prototype machine, in order to scan the code, needed a 500-watt light bulb. And it was deemed to be impractical, and therefore, basically, it got shelved. Joe and Bernard had to, they decided to sell their patent. They sold their patent, I think, for $15,000 to the Radio Corporation of America. Most of you know that as RCA. Joe moved on to IBM, and he waited until the technology started to develop a little bit further. And that happened in the late 60s. At the same time, a fairly unprecedented thing happened as well in the grocery industry. A bunch of supermarket executives and brand executives got together and agreed that they needed to come up with a standard. And the only question was, if they had the technology to read that code, was what that code was going to be, how they were going to implement it. And then this sharp-looking fella, George Laurer, was the winner of that RFP that got sent out. And in 1973, the very first article with a barcode on it was scanned. Actually, 1974, 8:01 a.m., June 26th, in Troy, Ohio, Sharon Buchanan at a Little Marsh's supermarket scans a 10-pack of Juicy Fruit gum. For 67 cents, that Juicy Fruit gum went on to change the industry that we work in. If you remember how we used to track sales, either happened one of two ways, right? We either did store audits and made a bunch of assumptions about the rotation of products, or we tracked shipments on the way out and made some assumptions about the sell-through. Well, here, for the very first time, we're able to track a real sale by a real purchase. Incidentally, that 10-pack of gum is in the Smithsonian Museum, not too far away from Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. But barcodes actually belong to a greater family of technologies that we call optical mark recognition. And if you want to look at where optical mark recognition starts, it's with punch cards. There are a couple of people, I think, in this room who probably remember punch cards. The census first started to use them. Thank you, son. The census first started to use them in 1890. Now, I don't think this picture is that old, although she does wear sort of an odd dress. But this is a punch card operator at the census. But I think most of us are probably more familiar with that. Show of hands if you've done a survey using optical mark recognition. There's a few of us here who've done some mail surveys. That's where I got my start. And actually, optical mark recognition has advanced to the point of optical character recognition, so we can recognize what people write. But machines haven't been limited to just data collection. They help us with analysis, too. Does anybody know what that is? That's a VAX mainframe. When I started my PhD in 1991, that was the machine that we used to do data analysis. And in those days, big data was something like the National Election Study. There were about 2,000 people, a couple hundred variables. And I had to write code that I would send over the wires to the operator. He would load the tape up in that little tape thing up there. And my code would run, my SAS would run, whatever it was. And 15 or 20 minutes later, I would get back results. And if I had a typo in my code, 15 or 20 minutes later, I would get back a nice error message that said to me, oh, you have to resubmit. So those were pretty long days in the computer lab for me when I was a PhD student. But it really all comes together in this magnificent device. The personal computer is a game changer for our industry because all of a sudden we have affordable computing power. And when we were able to network these machines, we have the ability to scale at massive levels, both data collection and data analysis. And it's what allows companies like AYTM or Servata or Zappy or any of our competitors who are here today to do the things that we do. We don't need an army of programmers anymore. We don't need an army of analysts. We have these technologies built into our platforms. The interesting part about that, though, is that we've always thought that machines have a limitation. And that limitation occurs because we believe that humans are necessary to do the interpretation. We know we need storytellers, or we need oracles. Do you all recognize the oracles on my page? Mm-hmm. That's the Matrix, that's the Oracle of Delphi, and everybody knows our pal Warren Buffett, the Oracle of Omaha. We've always thought that we need humans with their training and their skill and their intelligence to discern what the data have said and then put it together so that somebody can make a decision from that. Well, we would respectfully disagree. We believe the next wave of automation is here. The last wave of automation, the one we're on the downside to now, is the simple automation of programming and analysis. The next wave is the automation of interpretation. And this is going to happen from the low-hanging fruit in our industry. And I call these types of studies parametric decisions, right? And it's exactly how it sounds. A parametric decision is a decision that you're making when you have a set of known parameters that lead to that decision. Pricing is a good example. You need to know three things to do a pricing model. You need to know how much people are willing to pay. You need to know how many people you have who are paying it. And you need to know the cost of the good so that you can make a profitable decision. So we decided to do this on our platform, working with our client, Tyler. Are you here? Where is he? There he is. Hi, Tyler. Tyler works for Primo Waters. And Primo, some of you might know them, some of you might have their dispensers. They have water dispensers, and they also sell the water bottles as well. And so we wanted to create this type of capability in our platform. To do the analysis. And in our platform, it's just simply a drag and drop, right? It's not a template, it's not sort of fixed design. We drag and drop the pricing model into the study, and all we ask for is a description of the product and some basic information about whether they want to look and try to optimize sales frequency or revenue or profitability. And that's all the user needs to do. We know what questions we're going to ask. We actually did this as an enhancement on the Van Westendorp model of pricing. Some of you may know that. One of the criticisms of that model is that it's completely divorced from somebody's probability of buying afterwards. Well, we've solved that problem. This is the output from it. And this really is the thing that the decision maker ultimately needs to see at the end. This is a set of curves that shows at what price we will maximize revenue, at what price we will maximize profitability, at what price we'll break even, based on the sales, based on the preferences expressed by the people in our study. The interesting part about this, too, is that it is infinitely what-ifable. On our platform, when we do this, and behind the scenes, you can see there's actually a text-based interpretation that has variable text that's in it, and there's an infographic behind it, and there's a data table that shows all the data in it. It is infinitely what-ifable. He can go and look at it and say, I want to look at people who have dispensers versus not. I want to look at men versus women, young versus old, whatever it is. And the platform will optimize itself. So what have we done here for Tyler? Well, what we've done here is probably saved him at least 4 to 6 weeks and an immense amount of cost and resources by not just the survey part itself, but if you've ever been in this type of decision making inside a company, you know that there's a group of people who needs to sit down and create the Excel spreadsheets and do all those things. Tyler didn't have to do that. What we did was basically break down the barrier between him and the insights and created a solution that provided the interpretation for him. Now, what's interesting about this, obviously, is that the machine can't yet do the judgment. But that's actually a place where we still have business people who are making those decisions. But what the machine did was basically take the researcher out of the equation. We had Tyler was able to do high quality market research and get results, and then focus on what he did best, which was understand his business and make a decision. I would argue that pricing models are just the tip of the iceberg. In fact, I think most of the work that we do as an industry is parametric in design. When we look at ad tests or creative tests, those are fairly parametric. We have 2, 3 ads that we're testing. It's pretty easy to see what those results are and have the system spit out the interpretation. We can do this for tracking studies as well. I mean, I don't understand why anybody would want a 100-page deck with all of the charts in them these days when the system can be smart enough to recognize significant differences over time and then explore those differences and reveal those differences so that people understand what to do next. It goes on and on and on. I mean, you can think about new product development in a way where, if you think about what Melanie was saying yesterday about standardization, if you have a sort of a standardized format, you're able to do that. We're able to automate these types of things. But what about the researcher then? We know historically that we've kind of rejected the wave of technology that comes in on us. I actually think this starts to elevate our profession a little bit. I think it's something not only would we be fools not to embrace, but it gives us an opportunity to do the things that we have always said we wanted to do. Now, these are the most in-demand training topics in grit. And for sure, we know that people need the ability to tell stories. They're going to need to be able to synthesize data and understand what it means. But frankly, they need to go beyond just the interpretation in the PowerPoint. And of course, visualization and technology, understanding that will be important because technology will be replacing a lot of the mechanical and operational work that we do. It will free us up to do one of the most important things that we need to do, which is understand our businesses. And that's an argument that I made actually in a disruption article that I wrote in Research Live about 3 years ago now. This, for us, I think, is where we need to be as an industry. It elevates us. It gives us the opportunity to participate in the judgment that's there. And frankly, I don't think we get that much further in our careers if we don't start to do this, because we do see now that automation is moving in this direction. And I think it will be a matter of time where, since most of the types of work that we do lend themselves to this sort of thing, that if we're not helping and participating in that and able to act as consultants to our businesses, then we won't get called to do some of the other things as well. That's my talk. Does anybody have any questions? I see 1, 2.
When you were talking about your pricing study, you mentioned that you were able to factor in some kind of repurchase metric when you were modeling that. How do you do that?
We asked people how frequently they were likely to buy, or if they had the product, how frequently they buy it. Go ahead.
You mentioned Van Westendorp.
Yeah.
That'd be interesting. Do you find that the maximum revenue is generally speaking at the point of marginal expansion? In other words, point all the way over to the right?
Can you take the mic, please, to the rest of the room? Can you hear the question?
Okay, I've been doing Van Westendorp for a very long time, and I found it interesting you use that extension. I was wondering, when you're doing the optimization points, do you find that it's often at the point of marginal expansion?
No.
Which is the point in Van Westendorp all the way to the right?
No, the criticism of Van Westendorp is that it's divorced from somebody's probability of purchasing, right? So they can express a point at which they would say it's too expensive or it's too cheap or any of that. But at the end of the day, we kind of need to know whether they're likely to purchase it or not, right? And so that's an enhancement we've made to that model. So and it becomes then a function not just of whether they're likely to purchase it, but how many people are likely to do so as well. And because that's the driver, right? That's the driver of sales. Any other questions? Guys, if I can just leave you with one thought as you walk out today. Because in the town where I live last night, a couple of policemen got shot and killed by a radical Muslim person. Are there radical Muslims? Yes. Are there radical Jews? Yes. Are there radical Christians? Yes. Are there radical atheists? Yes. What binds these people together is not their religion. What binds them together is that they focus on the differences that we have as human beings. I would encourage you, as you leave this conference, or even when you're here, to think about it from the opposite point of view. Think about the things that we hold in common. When we're kids, we're born, we don't have prejudice, we don't have hate. You need food, clothing, and shelter. And when you start to think about how people live in the world, they tend to want the same things. When you think about commonality, you don't find yourself in a position of fear or hate. You start to find yourself in a position of empathy, compassion, and understanding. And that is a far better world to live in than a world of hate. Thank you.